Hey everybody, I am back for another video, and I'm here in Lexington, Virginia, and I'm going to take a tour of Stonewall Jackson's house. Come on, let's check it out.
General Bernard B. of the Southern Army was the one that uttered the famous quote, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall, rally around the Virginians." Bernard B. does not actually end up surviving this battle. His soldiers give two different accounts as to how he says this quote. The first one is, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall, rally around the Virginians." The second one is, "What are those Virginians just doing up there standing on that hill? Jackson's just standing there like a stone wall. He's going to get himself shot. We better rally around the Virginians or we're going to lose that position." So because Bernard B. does not end up surviving the battle, we don't know if he meant it as a compliment or an insult. However, the nickname stuck as a compliment. His nickname before the Civil War and the Mexican-American War was Old Blue Light because he had piercing blue eyes. So we know him as Stonewall because of General Bernard B. Does anybody have a guess as to what makes this a modern kitchen for the 1850s? Stove, exactly right. Most people at this time period were still using the open hearth methods of cooking, so the Jacksons were pretty revolutionary in that they did own a stove like this one. And in fact, the model of stove that they owned was the same one that was being installed in the White House at this time period. So, very high-end stove. The people who you would have usually found in this room would have been Jackson's slaves. He did own 6 slaves in his lifetime. The first 2 he purchased were named Albert and Amy, and those 2 were interesting in that when it came time for them to be sold, they actually approached Jackson and asked him to purchase them. We don't have any record of them ever saying specifically why they sought out Jackson, but we do know that he was well respected by African Americans in the community because of the Sunday school he ran at the Presbyterian Church, which was African Americans only. This room was mostly Amy's room. She was the household cook, and Jackson wrote that she was the best cook he'd ever had, which is a pretty high compliment coming from Jackson. He's something of a notorious picky eater, so Amy sort of had to be good at her job to put up with him. Other slaves Jackson received as part of his second marriage to Marianna Morrison. Growing up, Marianna had a slave assigned to her to be her nurse by the name of Hetty. Not a nurse as we would think of in our modern day terms. Hetty was only a couple years older than Marianna, and they were more playmates than anything else. Marianna considered them to be very good friends, so when she got married to Thomas and moved up here from North Carolina, she brought Hetty with her, as well as Hetty's 2 sons, Cyrus and George. The 2 boys were the ones that did most of the work around the house. The last slave that Jackson owned was a 4-year-old girl named Emma. He purchased her with the intent of raising her to be the handmaiden to his wife Marianna, and when we get upstairs, I'll show you the room where we think that Emma might have slept. But while we're down here in the kitchen, I do also like to tell you a little bit about the food that would have been prepared down here. As I mentioned, Jackson's a little bit of a picky eater, but that's not all his fault. He suffered from a condition called dyspepsia, which is acid reflux in our modern day terms. And there's no real way to treat it at this time period other than you just avoided eating things that would set off the condition. For Jackson, one of these things was red meat. So he was, for all intents and purposes, a vegetarian. He could eat fish and chicken, but much preferred to eat the vegetables he grew out of the kitchen garden or the 18-acre farm he owned outside of town. If you wanted to visit that 18-acre farm today, it's right about where Taco Bell is, which I don't know if Jackson would have approved of because I doubt you could eat Taco Bell with dyspepsia. Another thing that I like to address while we're here in the first room is the different artifacts that you'll be seeing as we go throughout the house. We have 3 different types of artifacts: periods, originals, and reproductions. Reproduction is, of course, a reproduction. Period pieces are ones that are from the 1850s, but not necessarily owned or used by the Jacksons here in this household. A good example of a period piece in this room is the stove itself. Looks exactly like a stove from the 1850s because this is a stove from the 1850s. It's just not the stove that Amy would have cooked at. whereas original pieces are ones we can say with authority were owned and used by the Jacksons here in this household. We have several originals throughout the house. I try to point them out as we go along, tell different stories about them. In this room, there's only one original piece, and it's beside me on the table here, the coffee grinder. Jackson, because of his dyspepsia, didn't drink coffee. He preferred to drink tea. But his wife, Mariana, enjoyed coffee, and this was Mariana's coffee grinder. It saw a lot of use about 160-ish years ago. Jackson moved into this house in 1859, so this is what the house looked like when he lived here. However, when this building was originally constructed in 1801, it was just these two rooms and the two rooms upstairs. But I'll go ahead and invite you all to step in here with me. Come on. And as you step in here, you'll see one of the weirdest features of the house is that it has two front doors. The reason for the existence of the second front door is because of the person who lived here immediately before Jackson. His name was Alexander Graham, and he was a doctor. This room was his doctor's office. So during business hours, he would have these double doors closed, and patients could come in through this door, and people making social calls could come in through the other door. So sort of his way of keeping the business life and the private life separated from one another, even though they occurred under the same roof most of the day. When Jackson moved in, this room became his personal study, and beside me we have one of the largest original artifacts in the house. This is Jackson's original desk. Now, you don't have to look very hard in front of this desk to notice that there's something missing. There's no chair for this desk, and that's not because we had the chair and lost it or we don't know what happened to the chair. It's because this desk has never had a chair. Jackson was a bit ahead of his time in thinking that standing up was better for you than sitting down, so he commissioned a standing desk for himself to do all of his work standing up. The work Jackson would have mainly been doing here would have been his letter writing. He was a very avid correspondent with his sister Laura, would write to her at least once a week, and he would also prepare his lectures at this desk. He was a professor at VMI. He taught natural and experimental philosophy, which includes astronomy, physics, optics, acoustics, all these things that as a history major I want to stay as far away from as possible. He also drilled the cadets in artillery tactics, and coming out of the Mexican-American War, he was considered one of the best artillery tacticians in the country. So he came very highly recommended for the job. However, as a classroom professor, Jackson has sort of gone down in history as one of VMI's worst. He would memorize his lectures, so when you went to his class, it was very obvious he was giving a recitation. He would sort of take on this monotone voice, and it's very easy to just let your thoughts wander off and pay no attention to what the major's saying. And then you'd snap back to the lecture and realize you had no idea what he was talking about. So you might be tempted to do one of the worst things you could possibly do in Jackson's class, which was raise your hand and ask a question. If you were the unfortunate soul who decided that they had the audacity to interrupt the major's lecture, not only would he scold you in front of the entire class, he would restart the lecture from the beginning to make sure you would get it the second time around. So people very quickly learned not to interrupt him. I do like to say though, his teaching methods aren't really all his fault. He wasn't trained in public speaking, he wasn't trained to be a professor. He was trained at West Point as an engineer. And on the wall there, we have a copy of Jackson's diploma from West Point. We do have the original in our archives, but that is the original frame that the diploma was received in. Now, Jackson was very, very lucky to get into West Point. Does anyone know about the process to being accepted to West Point today? No? It's a very competitive school. It's 2 people per congressional district and a runner-up, and you have to have a nomination from a senator to even be considered. Back in Jackson's day, you still had to have the nomination, but it was 1 person per district, no runner-up. And in Jackson's district, the way you got the nomination was all the young men who wanted to go to West Point got together, took a test, and whoever scored highest on the test got to go. Now, Jackson was an orphan by the age of 7. He was raised by his uncles on his uncle's farm, and they weren't a very wealthy family. So he didn't have many of the same advantages other young men his age did. He had no higher education, no private tutoring of any kind, and yet despite this, he ended up scoring 2nd place on that exam. The young man that got first went up to West Point, took a look around, decided he didn't like it, and came home. So Jackson sort of got in on a fluke. He heard that his friend decided not to go to West Point and ran around his hometown collecting letters of recommendation from anyone he could get to write one, leaves his hometown, which is in modern-day West Virginia, and travels to Washington, D.C., shows up on his congressman's doorstep, knocks on the door, hands over the stack of letters, and says, "Can I go to West Point? I got 2nd place." The congressman goes, "Well, you're a little bit late, but I'll see what I can do." He forwards it through to the Secretary of War, who forwards it through to West Point. Jackson ends up arriving on campus as an accepted student just a couple days before classes start. So quite literally, at the last minute. He starts out so far behind his classmates that at the end of his first year, he's dead last in his class. But through the hard work and determination he becomes known for, he graduated 17th out of 59, and other young men who graduated alongside him spoke very highly of him. One of these young men was George McClellan, who would become General George McClellan of the Union Army during the Civil War. And McClellan said that if they had gone to school for one more year, Jackson would have easily been top of the class because that's how quickly he was advancing. So he wasn't someone who was naturally born smart, or at least didn't have the means to show as much when he was a young man. However, Jackson was someone who set very high standards for himself, worked very hard to achieve those standards. I think part of his problem as a professor was that he held his students to the same high standard, so it was very, very easy to disappoint him. The 2 red pieces of furniture back there are original, as well as the stacking tables against the wall. And this chair is original, and the other chairs in this room and throughout the house have been based off of this one's design. 2 other original pieces in this room that I sort of like to talk about for a little bit longer are the 2 chromolithographs on the wall. Chromolithograph, just a super fancy way of saying picture. Memorize it, use it in front of your friends, they'll think you're a genius. But I like to talk about these 2 because I really feel like they showcase a softer side to Jackson that you don't hear about just studying him as Stonewall Jackson in the Civil War. Because as you can see, they both depict children. Jackson was someone who was really incredibly awkward in conversation with people around his own age. It wasn't that he didn't want to talk to people, it's just that he didn't believe in wasting people's time. So if you came up to him, asked him a question, he would give you a direct, short answer and nothing else, and it's sort of your responsibility to carry on the conversation one-sided. He really didn't have a lot of friends here in Lexington. He was very much respected, very much admired, but in terms of people who knew Jackson well, there were only a handful. One of these people, however, was the sister-in-law from his first marriage, Maggie Junkin. And Maggie wrote in her journals that despite how odd Jackson was among his peers, he was completely transformed around children. He'd get on the floor and wrestle with them, he'd speak Spanish baby talk that he'd picked up in the Mexican-American War, and he was someone who very much wanted to have children of his own. Unfortunately, Jackson's first wife, Ellie, died in childbirth only about a year into their marriage. He lost both her and the infant son. By his second wife, Mariana, they had 2 daughters, but the first one only lived for about a month before dying as an infant. So the only child of Jackson's to survive into adulthood is his daughter, Julia. But this is Mariana, Jackson's wife, and their daughter, Julia. This picture taken several years after Jackson's death in 1863. Is everyone familiar with how Stonewall Jackson died? Yes, no? All right, so I'll go ahead and give you all sort of the rundown of events on May 12th. The Battle of Chancellorsville in 1863 was, I like to say it was a great day for Jackson right up until it wasn't. The situation was basically the Union Army outnumbered the Confederate Army almost 2-to-1, and Jackson and his corps about single-handedly turned the tide of events by leading a surprise flank attack against the Union Army. He marched his men about 9 miles around the side of the Union Army, went straight into this attack, completely rolled the army up on its side, and turned the day into a Confederate victory. In the wake of this success, Jackson decided he was going to press the advantage in a night attack. Now, they don't have cell phones back then. They don't have walkie-talkies. The only way to really communicate between lines is to send a scout out, figure out what's going on, have them report back, and by the time they get back, situation's probably changed. So Jackson decided that he was going to cut out the middleman. He took several of his staff officers and went ahead to scout the enemy lines. The reconnaissance went pretty well. Jackson comes back, formulating battle plans in his head, and rides into his own lines, who do not recognize him. They open fire. 3 of the staff officers, which were with Jackson, were killed outright. Jackson was shot in his right hand, through his left arm, and in his left shoulder. Left arm has to be amputated there at Chancellorsville, and his arm is still currently buried at the field hospital in Chancellorsville. Not all of him is buried here in Lexington. He comes through the surgery well enough, but his doctors reported that in his weakened state, he contracted pneumonia and died about 8 days later on May 12, 1863. So it was a complication as a result from friendly fire that ultimately killed Jackson. Marianna never returns to this house during or after the Civil War. Especially after Jackson's death, it's too painful for her to come back here. So instead, for about 20 to 25 years after the war, this building was used as rental property, went through several tenants, until about 1890, when the building was quote-unquote donated for a sum of money to the Daughters of the Confederacy to become the first hospital in Rockbridge County. This building served as a hospital from the 1890s to the 1950s. It was a wartime hospital in World War II, and we still have people come to the house today that were born here, several of whom are my coworkers. So it's sort of an interesting legacy that this house has had on the community. And I like to say that it still technically is the only hospital here in Lexington. It kept the same name, Stonewall Jackson Memorial Hospital, just moved 2 blocks down the street into a new building. Interestingly enough, the chamber pot's one of the original pieces, so now you can go home and tell all your friends you've seen Stonewall Jackson's chamber pot. There it is. While we're in here, I'll go ahead and tell you all about the story about that trunk that I pointed out in the hall closet. As I've mentioned before, Jackson was raised by his uncles from the age of 6, and when he was 12 years old and his older brother Warren was 15, they decided, as all young men decide to do, that they're going to make their own path in the world. And at age 12 and 15, they decided their dream in life was to live on an island in the Mississippi River, chop wood, and sell it to steamships. And that's what they wanted to do. Their uncles were like, great idea, boys, go for it, have fun. So they went to stay with their cousins who lived on the Ohio River, and they got their own little raft, floated down the Ohio into the Mississippi, set up on a little island, and they were doing it. They were chopping the wood, selling it to the ships, making a pretty penny doing so as well. Both boys got deathly ill and were lucky to make it back home, but both did. The trunk that's in the hall closet is the trunk that 12-year-old Jackson packed his entire life into and took with him on that 6-month trip at 12 years old. So, just sort of a little fun story that I like to share. Tells you a little bit about Jackson in his younger days. While we're in here, though, I do feel like I kind of have to talk about the uniform back there on the chair. That is a replica of Jackson's Virginia militia uniform. The real thing is on display in the VMI Museum. They have a whole display on Jackson, including, interestingly enough, the raincoat he was wearing the night he got shot, and you can see the bullet holes in it. I'm a huge nerd, so I think that's the coolest thing that's over there. But as I said, they also have the real uniform. It's Virginia militia. The only difference between a Virginia militia uniform and a Union uniform are the buttons. These buttons have the state seal of Virginia on them, which is on our state flag, whereas Union Army buttons would have US or USA written on them. Jackson ends up wearing this uniform for the first year of the Civil War. And all of his soldiers are coming up to him and going, Commander, why are you going around wearing that Union uniform? Like, why don't you get yourself a proper Confederate uniform? Jackson's response was, well, it fits. I don't see a reason to get a new one. So his friend Jeb Stuart, who was cavalry commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, and I personally believe that Jeb Stuart is the flashiest commander in the entirety of the Civil War. Like, he's the guy whose coats are lined with red velvet. He has the hats with the giant feathers. His nickname in the Army was Beauty. He was very much into the pomp and circumstance of war. Jeb Stuart comes up to Jackson and goes, Thomas, no. You are a commander in the Confederate Army. You have to have a proper Confederate uniform. In fact, I'm going to buy you one. So Jeb Stuart went out and actually bought Jackson his first Confederate uniform. Jackson had a great deal of respect for Stuart. They'd been classmates together at West Point. So he accepts it, puts it on, wears it to one of their officers' meetings. And to give you a bit of Robert E. Lee's sense of humor, the first thing Jackson heard when he stepped into the tent was the general's voice saying, "Stand at attention, boys, we have a guest." Jackson was actually so thoroughly embarrassed by this comment that he didn't get it was a joke. He thought that he was actually unrecognizable in his new Confederate uniform, and it took several weeks of consoling him before he would put it on again. In the meantime, he went back to that one. I have had the question asked if it's because of that uniform that he shot the night of Chancellorsville, because as I said, the only difference is the buttons, and you kind of can't tell till you're that close. But this is not the case. He was wearing the Confederate uniform that day, and by the time that he was shot, it was dark, it was raining, he had his raincoat on over top of his uniform. It was a true case of mistaken identity that night that led to his ultimate mortal wounding. It's common tradition at the time period for the woman to sit facing the door, so as the slaves bring in the food, she can direct where they're to sit it down on the table. This room was important for more than just meal times, however, because this was the room where every morning at promptly 7 o'clock, Jackson calls together the entire household for morning prayers. 7 o'clock means 7 o'clock. If you're late, he locks you out. And there's at least one recorded instance of Mariana being locked out, so not even his own wife was exempt from this rule. He was very much a military man when it came to timekeeping. Jackson was a very devout Christian, born and baptized in the Episcopalian Church, but when he moved to Lexington, the rector of the Episcopalian Church, William Nelson Pendleton, was actually over in China doing missionary work. Whoever was filling in for him at the time, he and Jackson didn't see eye to eye on a few important matters, and most of the professors in town were going to the Presbyterian Church, so Jackson ends up joining there instead. It's there that Jackson opens up the African American Sunday School. Not the first African American Sunday School in Lexington, but it is the first successful one. And Jackson does something at this Sunday school that's considered very controversial. He believes in order to attain salvation, you need to be able to read the Bible for yourself. So Jackson taught slaves how to read, which was illegal at this time period in Virginia. It gave him a lot of bad reputation sort of among his neighbors, among the slave owners in town. And in fact, a warrant was rumored to be served against him for leading unlawful congregation of African Americans. It sort of became this whole controversy that made it into the newspapers in town. The warrant was never served, and the only reason we know about it was, as I said, because of the article in the newspaper about the rumor. But just giving you a little bit of an illustration as to how things were politically here in town. This teapot is original. It was owned by Jackson, but before it was owned by Jackson, it was owned by his mother. Now, Jackson went to live with his uncles at the age of 6, did not see his mother again until he was called to her deathbed when she died a year later. So his mother wasn't really a very strong presence in his early life. However, as a young man, Jackson wanted to go visit her grave. He knew that she was buried down in Anstead, which is where his sister Laura lived. So he went down there, stayed with Laura, and pretty much just started walking around through all the local cemeteries, checked every headstone, and he could not find his mother's grave. So he wrote a letter to his uncles that basically said, "Hey, I've been in Anstead. I thought my mother was buried here, but obviously I'm wrong because I've looked everywhere and I can't find her. Can you please tell me where my mother is buried? I want to visit her grave." His uncles wrote back saying, "We're sorry. You're not going to be able to find it because at the time of her death, we were too poor to afford a headstone. So she was buried in an unmarked grave." Jackson was completely devastated by this news that he would never know where his mother was buried, but he did own this teapot, which was one of the only things he owned that his mother had also owned. So it sort of became very dear to him at that point because it was one of his only connections to her. The other piece that I always conclude my tour with is the Bible in this glass display case. It is original. Jackson purchased this Bible as a gift for his sister Laura. Growing up, Jackson and Laura were completely inseparable. She's his little sister, just 2 years younger than him. And when Thomas is 15 and older brother Warren is 18, 3 years after their river trip on the Mississippi, Warren contracts tuberculosis and dies. So from that point on, Thomas and Laura are the only ones left of their original family. Everyone else had died due to various diseases. She lived in Anstead while he lived here in Lexington, but they had weekly correspondence with one another, and it's through these letters that we actually get most of our information about Jackson's life. He was never more honest with anyone than he was with his sister Laura. However, through these letters, Jackson begins to grow concerned that Laura is losing touch with her faith. So he bought this Bible for her as a gift to help her rekindle it. He buys it sometime in January or February of 1861. It's a very snowy winter, so he delays sending it, and then it's a very rainy spring, so he delays sending it. April 21st, 1861 rolls around. The VMI cadets are called off to leave and join the Confederate Army as Virginia secedes from the Union. Jackson goes with them, never having sent the Bible to his sister. So instead, Mariana took the Bible to North Carolina, and she wrote a letter to Laura that basically said, "Hey, I have this Bible from your brother. He got it as a gift for you. Do you want it?" Laura's answer was no, because she lived in Anstead, what becomes part of West Virginia. She opens her house as a Union hospital, becomes a Union nurse, and when Jackson sides with the Confederacy, she completely cuts all ties with him and never speaks to him again. Because he dies during the war, they're never able to reconcile. So instead, this Bible was given to one of Laura's sons and passed down through the family until being donated in its current state back to the museum. So it's sort of a sad story to end with, but it's the one that I always like to end with because I really feel it illustrates for you what happens to Jackson after he leaves this house. This is called the Stonewall Jackson house, but he was not Stonewall Jackson when he lived here. He was Major Thomas Jackson, veteran of the Mexican-American War, professor at VMI. It isn't until he leaves this house that the entire world turns on its head. You hear it said all the time that the Civil War is a war which divided the nation, but it's especially keenly felt in this area. If you drive west for an hour, you're in West Virginia. That's how close the line is. And when I was a student at Washington and Lee University, I looked into the voting records for Rockbridge County in the year 1860, just to see which way this county swayed on the issue of secession. And the vote here is literally 49-51. It can't get any closer. Rockbridge County and our neighboring county, Augusta, almost went with West Virginia when Virginia seceded from the Union. It was really hotly debated here in town. Several people were run out of town, including Jackson's father-in-law from his first marriage, who had to flee north for the entirety of the Civil War because of his pro-Union stance. You also hear all the time that the Civil War is a war which divides individual families, which is certainly true. But I can tell you, even growing up in Virginia, where I studied the Civil War for a year in elementary school, and now I have a 4-year degree in it, it still never really felt real to me until you hear stories like this one, the story of this Bible. Jackson's story is not exclusive. This sort of thing happened to families both north and south from all walks of life. It was a time in the country that really defined our history. And I sort of like to leave you with that, thinking about the impact the Civil War had not only on the occupants of this house and this county, but of this country, especially as we're still feeling its impact today.
And here is Thomas Jackson, otherwise Stonewall Jackson. This is his grave. A lot of old graves here. Wow, look at these graves inside this tree. Wow, man, this is something. This is creepy. Just imagine going in this thing at night in this tree. Buried underneath the tree. Wow, that is something. Alright, folks. Well, that was the video for today. Hope you really enjoyed it. Checking out Stonewall Jackson's house and the history around this area. Please like and subscribe. And also I'm on Instagram as well as Facebook. So please look me up as well. Thank you so much for coming along and hope you have a great day.